So we're all used to how-to books, roadmaps, IT and consulting systems that claim they'll just come, plug in and play and solve your solution. Unfortunately, these are generally uninformed guesses that seldom work. Hi, I'm Chris, I'm a doctor. I'm going to tell you about a different potential solution based on the Toyota way. In essence, Toyota, the popular car manufacturer, derives some of its success by its abilities to cultivate leadership, cultivate teams, build its culture, devise strategy, build relationships across the whole of the value chain, and importantly maintain a learning organization. You'll often hear Toyota and the lean model touted as kind of great business cases that people will often attempt to implement. Because if you have a management consultant who comes along, then they may give some helpful suggestions. But a lot of the time, these are simply implemented too superficially, because most companies would focus too heavily on the tools. There's many of these, such as the 5 S's, which focuses around cleaning and organising the workplace, the cells of the workplace. But you need to understand that with lean, an entire understanding of the full system is required, and being able to actually permutate an organization's culture. Because in most companies, you perhaps have some senior leadership buy-in, but these people may not be involved in the day-to-day operations, and therefore any continuous improvement efforts often fizzle out and often refer to these people in an ivory tower because they're just not on and understanding the real world of what goes on in day-to-day operations. And Toyota developed what was known as this Toyota Production System, TPS, and this tries to address pressing problems. That's the main thing about it. It tries to address a pressing problem, not just implement a solution. And as part of this, one has to observe the value stream from a raw material to a finished product. And then you can identify this stagnation where value isn't smoothly flowing. And this approach was actually radically different from other mass production thinking, which more focused on identifying and eliminating wasted time in an effort to separate the kind of production process from the customer. And Toyota perceives its mission, its vision as more than just short-term profits. In fact, it's about helping the community and staff in the long term, because working faster just for the sake of getting more out of your workers is not going to help. It's actually another form of overproduction, and potentially it means that you'll wind up employing more of a labour workforce overall. In Toyota, staff are actually motivated to identify and fix problems, so inefficiencies can be actually whittled out, because the staff are all aware that if a process isn't actually studied properly and rectified, then inefficiencies will occur. So you'll see this slide, and then you'll compare it with the next slide. And this is in which there's batch and queue systems with inventory buffers, and it therefore allows each part of that chain to almost work independently. And note, Toyota aims for a staggering 97% efficiency. Now there's a bit about inventory. How much do you hold? Because what nobody wants to do is have lots of surplus stock that they wind up paying to store somewhere, and then they can't find anything. There was even a bit in which the police were called to a factory looking for an item, and the police investigated it. Then it just turned out it was in the factory. It was just behind so much other inventory. So that's not what you want. What you want to be doing is occasionally holding extra inventory for high volume parts, because the high end finished products that people may want and the demand will fluctuate. You want to have some buffer there to meet that customer demand. However, the main way of doing this is what's known as a push-pull system. Now that's essentially when stock is low, then more is pulled in from elsewhere. And it means that the stock's all used and surplus potentially isn't built up. And if you look at other places that would use this, supermarkets would be the classic example. And one wonders in future, when it becomes more automated, if actually supermarkets will have this full push-pull system. So I went to London recently, and Amazon actually have their in-person Amazon Fresh shop, where you've got cameras everywhere. If you pick up something, then it charges you unless you put it down, not your partner, because then they may have a separate Amazon account. However, how that would be organized is a classic example of this push-pull system. Let's get back to the business. So standardizing. You want to standardize where things are kept, because a well-organized factory is actually often a very productive one. People can all find things. You don't want to be looking for where things are. And along with creating a kind of leveled schedule, factories need to try and reduce setup time in order to quickly change over between products and build in small batches. This requires system thinking instead of just thinking about localized optimization for one individual's work. Now, lean flow requires to eliminate these 3 M's. Apologies, my Japanese is very primitive. These are probably the only 3 words I know other than a bit of karate. So here we go. Muda, that's waste. We want to eliminate muda. Mura, unevenness. And mori, overburdened. In fact, those 3 M's were relatively easy to pronounce. Muda, mora, mori. Sorry, just showing off. But these are all interrelated. And Toyota learnt long ago that solving problems actually at the source of problem, at that point, saves time and money downstream. Because what you want to be doing is continuously surfacing problems, fixing them when they occur. This eliminates waste and productivity potentially soars. There's this continuous line stop process, and this allows problems to be rectified. And if you can give the workers access to small amounts of inventory, then when these inevitable failures occur, the employees can potentially solve these problems one by one. It may sound a bit bizarre, but if you overload somebody with too many tools, then it makes it more complicated and harder to be productive. Whereas the actual competitors who are running assembly lines, they try and just put them flat out. And that would mean that actually problems would get not looked at. There's no time, deal with it later, and then at the end of the production line, there's some issue or many issues that ideally could have been solved before and will affect future products. So Toyota's competitors did finally start to try and use Toyota's system, and they heard about this continuous stop process, but they didn't quite realize it. They thought it was stop the whole of the factory line. That was a mistake. So you'd almost push a button and then the whole thing would stop. No, what Toyota would do is push a button and that particular part would come to a halt. That problem would be reviewed, but the other stations are all still working, and that actually leads to a smooth process. And it's important thinking about how to teach people to bring problems to the surface, and so they can be quickly solved, because what you really need is people who can quickly identify a problem, but also identify how to solve this problem, because there's no point just doing what many of us would consider doing, just buy a new fancy thing and it'll solve that problem. I'll pull in a nice quote from Bill Gates, and he observed that the first rule of any technology used in business is that automation applied to an efficient operation will magnify that efficiency. Now that's not a surprise from somebody trying to sell software. However, he points out that the second rule is that automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify that inefficiency. So we do all need to be very careful when implementing and purchasing and acquiring technology to know that the underlying system is robust in the first place. There is a thing called a visual control, and that's a communication device at work in which you can just glance at something and you can see whether the work's being done well or if it's deviating from the standard. And that's a good thing if you can think of, just to remind workers what they're aiming to do. Now let's talk a bit about leadership. What tends to happen, particularly in the UK, probably elsewhere, is that there's a problem, somebody gets fired and they get replaced by an external expert who comes in, does well for a bit, then there's another problem, they go away with a large paycheck and another CEO comes in. Certainly that seems to happen in the Premier League if you follow that. However, these people who do this don't understand maths and regression to the norm, for example, but anyway, it's regression to the mean if you want to be pedantic. But basically, there's a bit of randomness, there's a problem, oh, this person will help it, then there's another problem, and that's the cycle that happens in the UK. Toyota are different. Toyota actually cultivate leaders so that they have an experience of all aspects of the business, and this can provide kind of a calming stability for the whole of the team. And leaders have been trained by Toyota. They've had their hands dirty. They have a practical and hands-on experience about all aspects of the business. And Toyota actually hires for potential, and it claims at least it really cares about the development of the employees. So human factors really need to be above any automation. If a process works in one factory with an automated fashion, you may think just stick it in the next factory, it'll work. But actually, in Toyota, the other factories are alerted to this, and then it's left to them and that team to implement the process in a way they see fit, and they may need to gain a bit of expertise before they can fully automate a process. Here's a few principles you may hear of. So one is there's no substitution for direct observation. 2 is proposed changes should always be structured as experiments, because you can always change back. 3, workers and management should try experiments as frequently as possible. Now these aren't just pointless experiments, they're experiments aiming to improve a system. And managers should also coach, not fix. It comes back to that Oxfam saying, if you give a man a fish, he'll feed his family for a day. If you teach a man to fish, they could feed their family for life. So you've got these managers who really need to coach and nurture staff. Now, how do you reward people? You think about extrinsic rewards. Now that may be money or something like that. And extrinsic rewards are good, but they are good when the work needs to be done. It's very clear and creative thinking is not required. But whereas if you need this kind of outside of the box thinking, new fresh ideas, then that's when money would be not helpful, because it will just push people to rush towards a goal, quickly solve something, and perhaps think less deeply about how best to address this issue. Therefore, in Toyota, extrinsic rewards are seldom given. In the NHS, it's unheard of to get a bonus, but anyway, life goes on. So, Toyota, you'll hear about their problem solving and this famous 5 whys. So, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Etc., etc., until potentially you've identified the issue. But it's very important when doing this that true problem solving requires actually identifying the root cause rather than the source. because the root cause of an issue, of a problem, often lies hidden just beyond that source. Now, a leader may try and understand something from what is referred to as an ivory tower and think in theory, but they may completely miss what a customer wants if they don't get out from behind their desk. And this is really encouraged by Toyota. And there's this concept, another Japanese word that will no doubt sabotage, called the gemba. And this is meaning the actual place. Because with a deeper understanding of the target audience, you may realize, for example, that a car boot needs to be a certain size because the target market buy lots of wood and they need to take it home. Okay? And I love the example of this Toyota leader who actually drove in many countries, I think all the states across America, just to see how driving in each place differed. And he found that in some places people maybe eat in their car as a norm. Other places they need to have huge journeys, so therefore they need to have 2 cup holders per person. Whereas in Japan, it may be that people don't eat in their car as a norm. So this was a way of really going to the actual place, finding out valuable information and making a product that works for the customer, not what you think from your ivory tower. Now, I'm a doctor, so I love this healthcare related example, and it had these kind of executives in a US pediatric hospital back in 2013, and the issue was that there were these blue babies, essentially a baby that stopped breathing and is peri-arrest and could die. And the management team were informed about this. So they thought, what do we do? Well, that's okay. Clearly, there's some kind of signaling process in place. What we need to do is buy expensive software to implement a solution. This way, it'll help. And they had some data. They knew that there was a target here, 30 seconds within an alarm going off. And the average was 150 seconds. So they thought, well, we need to do something. This computer system wasn't cheap, about $5 million, but fortunately one of them said, well, let's actually get out of the ivory tower and do the gemba. I doubt they used that word. But they went and visited the unit and they spoke to staff. And what they found was very enlightening. They said to the administrative assistants, what do you do when the alarm goes off? Oh, I just switch it off. Well, why? Why would you do that? There's a voice control. If the parents are worried, they can call through. And after all, the sensors keep coming off. So if the sensor comes off, the alarm goes off. They're all false alarms. That's what we do. So this led to some immediate changes. That was that the administrative assistants couldn't actually turn off the alarms. Only clinical staff could do it whilst in the room. And that immediately improved safety. Then, of course, what they did, they purchased better sensors and improved the system so that by training parents and actually telling them how to use this communication system, it meant that issues or concerns were identified much more swiftly. And in fact, they beat their target of 30 seconds down to 20 seconds from 150 seconds. And more importantly, it claimed there were then no more blue babies. So that's an example of executives needing to go to the coalface and do the gemba. Now, I mentioned earlier, and well done if you're still listening and got this far, that Toyota's a learning organisation, and you'll hear similar things in healthcare. But this kind of remains a bit abstract until it's translated into a mindset that is behaviours and scientific thinking. People as a whole prefer this kind of certainty. They want to believe they're right, and they don't want to actually check they're right and study anything and look at it. They're just, I'm right, this is what I think. But what Toyota does, it builds this culture through kata. Now, the martial artists amongst you will recognise this as practice routines, and in fact there's some great salsa dance and practice routines that I've seen from a place that has katas there. If you're interested, message me, I'll put you in touch. But anyway, this starts with a focus on the mindset and behavior, and only through this long process of repeated practice with corrective feedback from a coach can you actually then create a culture of scientific thinkers by utilizing katas. Now, if we think of iterative learning as one-by-one problem solving, where you can just break a problem into small pieces and learn from that, and you could have an experiment with each piece, that will inform change. But it's not just the small changes, that one or two, that will make a difference, but it's small changes with a clear direction and seeing the overall purpose that will actually bring about massive changes and improvements to your company. Now, we've all lived through the COVID pandemic. That was hard, and I think one good thing that came about it was that some of the kind of bureaucratic red tape was cut briefly. But the difficulty is this may come back because organizations, some of them quickly adapted, learnt, they changed values accordingly and had higher levels of trust, engagement and communication with employees. But because so many of the executive team are actually not thinking and have experience of the actual coalface, some of these changes won't sustain, because then they'll go back to, well, you need to fill in a 60-page form to do something that's clearly in everybody's better interest. But just remember, each organization is in its own unique position to have its own strategy. Many people just think, I'll just copy the visions from a different similar organization, and by kind of benchmarking against that company, it'll help you. But that can actually stunt creativity and set you back, because what you need is your own culture built up and your own unique vision for your company. And at the core of every successful culture, it's trust. Now, trust comes from actions, not words. And it's when you see somebody behaving consistently over time, showing understanding, competence, concern for you as an employee and for other team members, fairness, that then you may trust them. And it takes a long time to build up, and unfortunately, just one or two passing comments is enough to just destroy trust. So it's much easier to destroy trust than build it, but I want you to build trust with the people that are important to you. Because remember, culture change takes time. You must think into the future. And also, finally, if you have an assumption, test it. Don't just assume. Thanks for listening. Really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.